Let's move right along to our featured presentation today. So I'll do your intro, Dione, and if you want, you can pull up your slides. Um, so our featured speaker today is Dionisio Gamoso. Dione is an Oakland native, and he works as a biological sciences technician in restoration for the Presidio Trust in San Francisco. He also recently completed his master's thesis on native bees and plant use in formal designed landscapes through Gretchen Lebune's lab at San Francisco State University. In his free time, he walks his boxer lab mix, Donna, and while she's sniffing the flowers, he has his nose in them too, looking for bees. So, in Dione's session today, we'll explore the critical role of native bees in urban ecosystems and how IPM principles can be applied to design and maintain pollinator-friendly gardens. We'll learn about bee diversity, natural history, and the ecological functions that support healthy urban habitats. This presentation will emphasize practical strategies for creating resilient pollinator gardens that minimize harm to beneficial insects while also managing pests effectively. So over to you, Dione.
All right, thank you. And thanks to the SF Environment team for inviting me. It's great to be here. And good morning to everyone. So for today's presentation, I have a couple of goals. One is that everybody take home 3 ideas that they can put into practice at their job that make sense for the situations you find yourself in. So 3 take-home applicable things. And then my other goal is that I describe it as getting those mental juices flowing. So basically thinking about pollinators in relation to our land management practices. Are you all getting an echo? Because I'm getting an echo. Okay. Sorry
Yeah,
about that. Not sure why.
I'll mute whoever's unmuted.
Okay. And to help us be thinking, I really hope that people will participate. So there's lots of opportunities for us to participate through the chat or even unmic. And I really hope you'll do so. It'll make it more interesting, engaging, and I think we'll all benefit from it. All right, I'm going to proceed. So bees. Today's presentation is going to be focused on bees, but it will benefiting bees will benefit everything else too, and a lot of it benefits many other pollinators. So our line out, we will learn what makes a bee, meet some of our local bees and their lifestyles. And part of that, the reason I want to do that is that natural history information we will then apply to IPM. And what we can do to provide habitat for bees, that's also where their natural history comes in. And then discuss ways to practice IPM with pollinator welfare in mind. So let's start out with a little fun quiz. Am I a bee? And if you want to put these in the chat, I encourage you to do so. Which of these 6 insects are bees? Take a close look. All right, so it's these 3. And just for size reference, that top right one is smaller than a grain of rice. It's more like a gnat-sized bee. The green one is about the size of cooked orzo. And then the bottom right, a wool carder bee, it's like closer to a honeybee size. And those other guys, we had a wasp on the top left, a sand wasp. Look at those thin legs with little spines for capturing prey. The robber fly, which is a bee mimic and actually eats bees. And then lastly, in the bottom middle, we have a hoverfly with its stubby little antenna and eyes all the way forward and its wings splayed out. So what makes a bee a bee? Well, here are some features. Bees have long antennae. They've got large eyes on the side of their head. They often fold their there were two pairs of wings on their back. And then notice those hairy legs and the hair on the body. That's actually a really important feature for distinguishing bees, and one of the features that makes them an important pollinator. And how I describe bees, bees are essentially wasps that went vegetarian down the evolutionary line. Oops. One second. So for their protein source, it's actually pollen. And what do they do with that pollen? That's a bee larva set on top of a pollen provision. And that's going to be its baby food during the course of its development. So pollen is baby food for wasps. I'm sorry, for bees. And my first experience with a bee was going to a swim lesson when I was, I don't know, like 6 years old, and feeling this sharp pain on my foot when I was learning how to bob. And I came out with a honeybee attached to my foot and, screamed, of course, and it pulled out the stinger. And for much of my life, that's what a bee was the honeybee. And then later I discovered the bumblebee. And those were the two bees that existed in my world. But now when I say bee, and from now on throughout the presentation, this is what I mean when I say bee. Just here in San Francisco, we have well over 100 species of bee right here in a very urbanized city. And wherever you are, whether you're watching from a field station, you're out in the field, or you're right in your cement-covered neighborhood, these bees are all around us right now. They're just hidden in their little burrows and nests, waiting for the right conditions of spring to come. And a little bit about bee diversity. So I work in the Presidio, an urban national park in San Francisco. And here alone, we have about 80 species of bees, at least. In California, 1,600 species of bees. North America, 4,000. And worldwide, 20,000 species of bees. And I'm going to focus on a couple of bees just so we can get to know them and their life histories, which we will then apply to land management and IPM. So first, I'm going to start out with probably the most common of our native bees and noticed are the bumblebees. And I am already seeing them now, and I've been seeing them for the past couple of months. And the majority that I've been seeing are the queens that are emerging from their, I think it's called hibernacula, basically their little hibernation den underground. And they emerge and they start foraging for early blooming pollen, flowers, and they start a colony. So she starts the colony from scratch. And funny thing is, as she lays her eggs and collects pollen for them, she'll actually incubate them like a chicken to keep them warm. And that colony will develop during the course of the spring with more and more workers who then take on the role of provisioning for the colony. At the end of the summer, that colony will actually die, with the exception of what I'm calling princesses or next year's queens, who then again overwinter in an underground burrow. If you look at number one of that diagram, one of their favorite nesting habitats is underground in old rodent burrows and at the bases of tufts of bunch grasses, an important habitat feature. And one super cool thing about bumblebees is a lot of our agricultural fruits and vegetables are made possible through them because they have the key that unlocks the anthers that require buzz pollination. So plants that require buzz pollination do not have the pollen readily accessible, and rather it has to be vibrated open to release the pollen. And bumblebees have that key of C vibration of their wings that releases the pollen. All right, all you IPMers, if you see this, is this a sign of a fungus, a plant disease, a a herbivorous pest, or it's actually something we want. This is the sign of leafcutter bees, Megachilidae. And what do they do with those cut leaves? Well, they wrap their babies and pollen in them in a little packet. So they'll cut those leaves and bring it back to their nest, and into that they pack a bunch of pollen and then lay their eggs. So I don't know if you're familiar with these kind of like Asian snacks where they wrap rice and stuff in a banana leaf, but that's what it reminds me of. And these guys will pack these leaf packets, leaf pollen egg packets into dead wood crevices, old beetle burrows, rock crevices, pithy stems, and even snail shells. So most of these guys are cavity nesters. All right. And just a quick quiz question. If you look in that black and white photo at the red arrow, any guesses what that's pointing at? You can put it in the chat if you like. So that's actually, those of you familiar with Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, that's actually the windmill of Golden Gate Park, really close to Ocean Beach. And the reason I show that slide is just to show people the sand dunes that used to cover 1/3 of San Francisco. And here in the Presidio, we actually work to restore those sand dunes back to their native plant communities. And why we would do that? They're very rich in floral diversity and, of course, everything that depends on those. And to manage those sites, we work with volunteers. And my boss and I were out scoping the site for a volunteer program, and we noticed all these, what we thought were wasps, buzzing around our feet, just hundreds of them. And we're like, we're not bringing our volunteers over here. We're going to work at a different spot. But my boss mentioned it to our wildlife ecologist, John Young, who mentioned it to a bee expert who came out, Dr. Leslie Saul Gershons, and identified them to be the silver digger bees, a sand dune specialist. And what was cool was um, these bees had not been seen in San Francisco in large nesting aggregations for close to 100 years. And so we like to think that they liked what we were doing with the place, restoring these ancient sand dunes. So I'm just going to play this. Keep your eye on that hole. Oh, wait. So that's really an up close photo from my camera, um, looking at one of the holes in this large nesting aggregation of a mama bee who's excavated this single hole and laid a single egg in there. And she'll excavate several different holes and lay a single egg in each one of those. And one of the key things I want to point out about these silver digger bees is that they are representative of many of our native bees and that they are ground nesters. About 70% of our native bees nest in the ground in tiny little holes. And while I'm at it, while I have this close up, if you look just to the right of that hole, that's the light gray green plant with the toothed leaves, that's our federally endangered San Francisco Lysingea. And then around it are some of the plants that we don't want there competing with it. So we got Hypocris in there and those non-native annual grasses like rat-tail fescue. And we'll touch on that in a little bit, how we manage for that. I'm just going to throw this in because it's interesting. I finally met Dr. Leslie Saul Gershons after having told this story about the silver digger bees, and she told me about her research. I'll just say this is kind of cool. For the this beetle in the top center is a nest parasite of Habropoda. But how does it get into the nest? So if you go to B to the left of that clockwise, what they do is they lay a bunch of eggs at the base of the foraging plants of these Habropoda. And then when those eggs hatch, they en masse, all together coordinatedly, climb up that plant to the height of where flowers would typically be found, and they are the same size and roughly the same shape as a female silver digger bee. And then here's the crazy thing. They actually release a pheromone that mimics the female pheromone of the silver digger bees. So if you go to the bottom center, that's a male silver digger bee flying towards what it believes to be a female silver digger bee to mate with her. When he tries to mate with that mass of larvae, they in synchrony jump on his back. So that's what you see on the picture at the top right. So now he's covered with these larvae, or the trigols? I can't pronounce it. But anyway, these parasitic larvae. And then he goes flying around to find an actual female digger bee. When he mates with her, they jump onto her back. And then she eventually flies into her nest to lay her eggs or bring her pollen. And that's how they parasitize the nest. That was her research. So I have just had to share that with you. All right. So why are bees important? Well, to illustrate that, let's imagine waking up to a world without bees. So you rub your eyes, you get out of bed, you groggily walk over to the breakfast table. And before you is this great breakfast spread that your family has prepared for you lovingly. But in this world without bees, things start to disappear. So no blueberries. Oh, there goes the cantaloupe. Definitely no avocado toast. The strawberry jam. Definitely no almond butter. Butter too? And cream. What about coffee? So coffee is actually it can self-pollinate. But with bee pollination, the beans are 70% larger. So in a world without bees, you'd get a quarter cup of coffee and a dry piece of toast. When you go to a grocery store, this is our choices with bees on top. And in a world without bees, that's what you get. So many of the minerals and vitamins in those vibrantly colored fruits are made available to us because of bee pollination of those plants. 1 in 3 bites of food that we eat every day is made possible by bees. And again, when I'm talking about bees, I'm talking about honeybees, but all of the wild bees as well, as they play an important role in agricultural pollination. And especially where there are natural areas intact adjacent to ag fields. They'll come in and pollinate for free without us having to do anything. If they're feeding us, they're feeding everything else in the ecosystem, making it possible for them to eat as well, all the plants that they pollinate and the seeds and fruits that are produced. They are foundational to the global ecosystem. 87% of Earth's plants are animal pollinated, and bees are the #1 pollinator. But bees are in decline all over the world. So greater than a quarter of all North American bumblebees are considered threatened. 50% of leafcutter bees, which is a huge family. So those leafcutter bees in North America alone, we have over 600 species, and that's not even a quarter. There's a couple thousand worldwide. And greater than a quarter of all mason bees, another huge family, are also considered at risk. And the other thing is, not a lot of people 100 years ago, 50 years ago, were studying bees. They're not an easy organism to study. And so we have very little baseline information to base this on. So they're an understudied organism. The good news is urban areas are surprisingly a refuge for bees. So wide diversity of bees can be found right in a regular old urban neighborhood. And often in comparison to adjacent, let's say, ag lands or even adjacent natural lands, such as the desert, which are rich in bees, they've often found, a couple of studies have found even a greater richness of bees in urban areas, perhaps due to the diversity of nesting habitats available. The other thing about urban habitats is that there are people who want to make a difference. And that's what some of the research that I worked on is, can we make a difference for bees literally right outside our front door in small patches? So one thing we looked at was create food for pollinators in the urban design landscape. And here comes the place where I work, the Presidio. If you look at that overview, we have different landscapes, historic forests, non-native historic forests, very formal design landscapes of mowed lawns and planter beds around buildings. And then we have remnant natural areas that we are working to actively restore to native plant communities. And one of the initiatives that we have embarked on is we're using the term ecological horticulture, but it's essentially to try to take the design landscape as from the military era, which had no consideration of no ecological considerations, and turn them into ecoscapes using a combination of ornamental plants and native plants. And so my research looked at taking plots that had ornamental plants in place, and then to them adding what I'm calling bouquets or suites of native plants. In this case, one suite of plants was native host plants to specialist bees who only forage on particular plant families or genera, and then other native plants that are just known to be bee-friendly. And we took those plants and we added them to existing design landscapes that already had ornamentals in place. And again, the hypothesis was adding native wildflowers will increase bee species richness and abundance. And this was our result. So in our landscape plots to which we added native plants, about just 65. So think about 2 large coffee tables together. We saw a 20-fold increase in bee abundance using those plots and a 7-fold increase in bee species richness using those plots. And these plots weren't even fully developed yet. The study happened very quickly. So these were relatively small plants. And also in the native plant augmented plots, we found 14 unique species in the 2 different treatments not found in the controls, and the controls had no unique species. We also encountered or captured many, many hoverflies, which are important. I call them IPM specialists. Their larvae eat aphids, and they're also important pollinators. And we also had visiting our plots many native social wasps, also important for IPM, keeping down other herbivorous insects. So a couple of things that seem to contribute to this increased abundance and diversity, and richness at the native plant augmented plots. One was we just added more flowers to begin with. More flowers, great for bees. But we also added a diversity of flowers, which may have attracted different types of bees. And how that might work, an important thing too, when we planned the plant palettes for the native plant treatments, we made sure to include flowers that bloomed all the way, that had overlapping and staggered bloom times, staggered and overlapping bloom times from the beginning of the bee season in February all the way into October. Because bees, just like plants, have their emergence time. So there are early season bees that emerge, like let's say in February and March, and they come out hungry, they need pollen. So thank goodness we planted some early blooming flowers as a food source. As those flowers senesce, another suite of bees comes out in April and May. Different species, and they're hungry. Thank goodness that we have mid-spring blooming flowers to provide habitat for them. And then as the summer progresses, the summer bees come out, different species. We planted late summer flowers, and there's forage for them, and so on. So that's a really key thing that I factor in when designing plant palettes for pollinators is staggered and overlapping bloom times to provide for the entire suite of emerging bees over the season. What about ornamentals? So, like I said, we planted into areas that had ornamentals already in place, and then we augmented them with native plants. My personal opinion, and from what I observed from our data, is you need to be selective with your ornamentals. With native plants, you almost can't go wrong. So a study by Frankie et al. Looked at native plants in the Bay Area, or sorry, plants commonly planted in people's front yards in the Bay Area, and found that close to 80% of native plants were substantially bee attractive. Versus, actually, and they only surveyed about 50 native plants, whereas they surveyed something like 1,500 non-native plants and only found about 9.5% of the non-natives to be bee attractive. So a much smaller percentage of ornamentals tend to be very substantially bee attractive. But when they are, they can be a huge bonus to a planter bed. So in our study, this pink flower, the rock purslane, was actually our #1 attractive plant, actually. It actually outcompeted our natives in terms of abundance and richness for bees. But again, even in our study, it was very few ornamentals that were that kind of bee attractive. And so these types of ornamentals, I would suggest looking up in literature-based what do you call it, handbooks to find bee attractive plants if you want to use ornamentals. Be selective. All right. And this small pot, again, with its 20-fold increase in native bees, 7-fold increase in bee richness, has me thinking, wouldn't it be great to scale up beyond the Presidio? And it has me looking down at San Francisco and the thousands of tiny pieces of land where you could fit 2 coffee tables worth of plants. And what a huge impact that would make on that scale. And creating corridors that link larger habitats using these small planter beds. And the great thing about it is that it's doable by any organization or even individuals. It's a great way for community stewardship. You can literally do it right outside your front door with even a potted plant. The bees will come. So that's been talking a little bit about food, but that's only, well, I compare it to a 3-legged stool. One of those legs is food, but there are 2 other important legs. I'm going to use this finger, the ring finger, which are shelter and safety. So I'm going to talk a little bit about shelter, equally important as food. So in my work doing habitat restoration, I do a lot of weeding. And one of the plants that we control is Himalayan blackberry. And I've long told people, oh, I've read that you should leave the canes. Bees will nest in the dead canes. And so instead of hauling the stuff out, we cut the canes and we left them on site. And I came back a year later, I was like, you know what? Why don't I just actually look? And I noticed, I started looking at the dry canes and noticed that there were these perfectly round holes on many of them. And my curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to break one open. And the second one I opened, there it was. This was actually the tiny cousin of those large, big black carpenter bees that you might see burrowing in wood. This is Ceratina. It's a tiny gnat-sized bee. And after I saw this and got excited and I stepped back and I looked at the canes that we had left, I could then see so many of these tiny bees hovering around. I didn't notice them at first because they were like little gnats. But it's basically free housing, and it reduced our work of not having to haul out these canes. By simply leaving them on site, we created habitat for them. So cavity nesters, or things that nest in holes, comprise about 30% of our native bee species. So that can be cut stems even on living plants. It can be pieces of stumps, rock walls, and pithy stems left on site. The other bees are actually ground nesters, like our silver digger bee. So 70% of our bee species are actually ground nesters, and they need sparsely vegetated bare ground and sunny, well-drained soils. So when I think about it, like that bottom right picture of the kind of sparsely vegetated bare ground is considered an eyesore for many land managers, but that can actually be a haven for bee nesting. And how I'd like to describe it is um, it's difficult to manage in all of our sites. Like, who has time to manage every square foot of areas that we work in? So those eyesores, you might put your energy elsewhere in the, let's say you're into aesthetics is important for you. You might consider a mullet approach. Business up front, party in the back. Put your energy where it's visible and leave some of those areas bare of vegetation or less sparsely vegetated and less manicured, as those are important nesting habitats. One thing I want to point out, actually, let me go back. These holes can be tiny. So many of our bees are gnat sized. So the holes are probably, you could fit, like, it'd be tough to fit a toothpick in some of these things. They are absolutely tiny, and the bees themselves are tiny. And bees need to navigate back to their nest holes. So remember, most of our bees, or I don't know if I mentioned this, the vast majority, 90% of the world's bees are actually solitary. And I describe it as being a single mom. It is none of the clean stuff. Single mom is the common lifestyle of the more archetypal lifestyle of our bees. That means it's a single female having to take care of the brood all by herself, do all of the pollen provisioning, excavating the nest, and doing all of the grocery runs. She needs to accurately be able to find her way back to her nest. And this is a diagram of a study back in the 30s that discovered that bees actually do an orientation flight, or that's been demonstrated with many solitary bee species. When they first emerge from their ground nest in the morning, they start zigzagging back and forth, back and forth. And the authors hypothesized that they were getting oriented to their landscape. And so they actually conducted an experiment where they moved the pine cones that were adjacent to these nest holes. And when the bee would return, it would invariably go back to that formation of pine cones because it was using that as a landmark. But I point this out because this is also important for IPM management. We can impact bees' ability to navigate. All right, so now we've talked a little bit about the food needs of bees. Native plants are awesome. You got to be selective if you're going to use ornamentals. We've talked about cavity nesting bees, ground nesting bees, and the last part will be safety. But let's just look at this garden real quick and see, let's look at it through our bee eyes, our compound eyes, and see, is this a bee-friendly habitat for me? Is this some place I would want to forage in or nest? If people want to, you can just type in the chat something that you see as either a positive thing about the food or something that's missing with the food, or something that you notice about the shelter components of this habitat. Okay, so let's just talk about the food. I see a diversity of plants there. I don't know these plants in particular, but what I do see is some are in bloom, some look like they're senesced, and some might have not yet bloomed. So that's a good sign. There's enough diversity that there might be bloom over a staggered overlapping bloom times. And there's a diversity which may attract a diversity of pollinators. That looks good. Shelter. So definitely I see those wooden stumps placed there as seats. They can double as cavity nests for burrowing bees. So that's a good feature. There's some bare ground left unmulched and not covered with grass. So that could serve as a ground nesting site for bees. We've got that boulder there that will have crevices into which bees could burrow. And they even have a water source. Bees need water. So honeybees might use it to bring back and they cool off their hive. But native bees, for example, because many of them are ground nesters, they'll actually make many trips to water and bring back to their planned nest site and drop that water there on the mud to soften it up so that they can actually dig into there. And also some of them will help paste um, their pebbly um, their pebbly nest together with mud. So water is an important feature, or it can be a death trap. So if you look at that photo, that bee, it's a gentle slanting slope to the water. That's super important. If it's a very steep-sided, like a doggy bowl or something, that's basically a death trap for bees because they fall in and they can't get out. So having either corks in there or partially submerged pebbles where there's kind of like a platform where they can land and then dip their little proboscis in there, that's super important. All right, so let's just take this. This is a spot in the Presidio, our landscape as it is from the military era. Um, let's just look at this again through our bee eyes and see how could we, well, what features are positive about it for bees, and then what improvements could we make? Okay, so one thing, these shrubs are Grevillea lanigera, a non-native shrub. They produce a ton of flowers. So that's one positive thing, but uh, it's only one species there. So in terms of overlapping and staggered bloom times, we don't have that. And we don't have native plants in this photo, which that's always a really positive thing. So I would want to improve this, I would want to incorporate a greater diversity of plants and ideally incorporate some native plants into this. Two, in terms of shelter, let's just start with our ground nesters. I do see a little bit of bare ground in the photo, so that could potentially be a spot where ground nesting bees could burrow in. The mulch doesn't look too thick. That could allow for burrowing bees to get down to the ground level. I don't see much dead wood there. So a simple thing might be to take, let's say I'm pruning roses nearby, I might drop them down on the edge of the shrubs or underneath that palm tree, and there is some nesting habitat, at least for cavity nesters, made available that way. Or let's say we wanted to protect this from trampling, I might use split rail fencing to keep people from cutting through there. And that split rail fencing with untreated wood could eventually serve as nesting habitat for wood burrowing bees. A great resource for looking up native plants to incorporate into landscaping is Calscape. And I love that website. You can just type in like the conditions you're looking for, the type of plant community you're interested in, or what light conditions or water conditions, and it will give you recommendations for native plants, as well as some of the wildlife that they provide habitat for. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about safety. And of course, when talking about safety, we got to touch on pesticides. So I'm curious if people can think about, ways that bees can be exposed to pesticides. If you want to put it on chat, please feel free, or on mic. All right, so some of the ways that bees might be exposed to pesticides are: one, direct contact. We spray a bee while it's on a flower. But another way is the residual contact. So we sprayed the flowers, but now the bee comes to visit it, and either it gets, it kind of wades in that liquid, or B, it's collecting pollen that has been sprayed, or B, it's collecting pollen from a plant that has a systemic herbicide in there that may have worked its way into the pollen, or C, I'm losing track of my letters. It's remember how we have those leafcutter bees, for example, that collect pieces of leaves from plants and then wrap both their pollen and their egg in that leaf. So that kind of indirect contact with contaminated plants. And then that relates to that whole nesting material idea. And then lastly, we can spray the ground or like the nest sites. So for example, with the silver digger bee example, even though those were solitary bees, they were nesting in a large aggregation. There are hundreds of them in a few square meters, each of them with their own entrance and own burrow. So seepage into the ground. And I just want to review how pesticide toxicity is measured. So we talk about the LD50 or lethal dose 50, where 50% of the test organisms die within 48 hours of exposure to that pesticide. So the exposure in the lab either involves oral input into the bees or droplets of the pesticide on the bee. And that helps determine the toxicity warnings that they give on the label. But we want to think about that critically because A, the test organism they use for just about all the insects is the honeybee. It's basically like the lab rat of the insect world. It's an easy test organism. But is it actually a good representative for butterflies, moths, hoverflies, wasps, etc., that these toxicity ratings are that are recommended for? So again, bees are understudied in general, and native bees are even more understudied. But some of the research says that we should be we should think about this critically when we look at the label. So for example, there was a study looking at two bees, honeybees and Osmia cornifrons, both commonly used for the pollination of apple orchards. And they looked at 5 different pesticides, and they found that honeybees and this osmia responded differently to these different pesticides. So for example, honeybees were considerably more sensitive to imidacloprids than osmia, but osmia was a lot more susceptible to acetamiprids than honeybees. So it might not be this one-to-one. If honeybees are susceptible or they have this LD50, that means all bees are that way. A meta-analysis looking at the LD50s of 19 different bee species, found as much as a 1,000-fold difference between these species when compared to honeybees. So again, a little skepticism: is the honeybee necessarily a good representative for all other species? Another important factor is, in standard studies, they only test the active ingredient. So for example, for Roundup, they're testing glyphosate, and that's what they base their toxicity rating for pollinators on. There's been a few studies that have looked at the so-called inert ingredients, and one by Chen, Fine, and Mullen in 2019 looked at the effect of just the surfactant on bees, and found that the surfactant without the active ingredient caused a 90% mortality relative to the control. Okay. Then so we have death as one of the potential impacts on pollinators. Another important thing with the use of, let's say, herbicides is actually the loss of forage. So, for example, looking at the monarch populations on the east and the increased use of glyphosate, they see this connection, a connection between that increased use of glyphosate and the decreasing populations of monarchs because of the loss of their forage of those weedy what's considered weedy landscapes. The glyphosate has been used to kill off their host plants, and that's likely the cause, or one of the important causes for their declines. Then there are sublethal effects. So not just, again, the standardized test in the lab is the bee dead or not dead? But sublethal effects have also been recorded in bees. So these have included decreased foraging ability, impaired navigation. Remember how they have to find their way to both their foraging sites and make their way back to the nest. Egg and larval mortality, and compromised immune system. So some specific examples: fungicides, in a study by Arts Pittsinger 2015, found fungicides to affect nesting ability, nest finding ability, and then neonicotinoids were found to reduce offspring output and also see an increase in male-biased broods. So the less male-biased broods, males actually bees can choose what sex their offspring are going to be, and males actually the eggs are smaller and they require less pollen to sustain. And so when bees are stressed, they may bias their broods towards males, which have less reproductive output. Also with neonics, they found suppressed foraging. With 2,4-D chemical, they found it to kill or weaken honeybee larvae. And also studies have seen changes in gut microbiomes in bees, which can be related to decreased immune system response. Jumping out of the bee world, a study on butterflies, the spice bush swallowtail, when their eggs were exposed to glyphosate, they found a 6% hatch rate versus 100% hatch rate with uncontaminated control eggs. And these studies are not captured by the standard industry tests in the lab. All right, but I'm going to say that I actually do use herbicide in my job, but I'm trying to do it more thoughtfully with consideration of pollinator welfare in mind. So I'm going to give an example of a situation where I actually used herbicide and my thought process through it. So, well, first of all, herbicide is my last resort. And here I am tasked with managing an area that I call Robb Hill Dunes. It's an ancient remnant San Francisco sand dune in which we have our endangered plant, San Francisco lozenge, as well as many rare dune annual plants. We also have done introductions of the silvery blue butterfly here, and their host plant, the deerweed, the native deerweed is here. And of course, we have the silver digger bees. But one of the challenges to managing this site is the non-native annual grasses. So here has been the way I've been trying to approach it for the past 16 years. I use the different tools in the toolbox, including tarping, weeding. Thank goodness we have volunteers, competitive natives, and then lastly, last resort, herbicide. So let's just take a look at each one of these methods of weed control and think about it through the IPM framework with pollinator or bee welfare in mind, because I think each thing has its pluses and minuses. So in the larger, you see that kind of black strip there. Here in the Presidio, we use black lumite for our tarping. And we'll lay it over areas where we want to kill oftentimes annual weeds, such as annual grasses with smaller root systems, basically. And ideally for me, I try to do it early in the season, right when they've germinated, so that I can leave the tarp down for a short period of time. So, and kill those annual weeds without killing the native perennials that have also been covered up. They can withstand that short period of time. So thinking about that from the weed management practice, I love it. It's like non-toxic. It's a very thorough kill. It's pretty efficient time, energy-wise. I love it. But how about impacts on bees? Any thoughts about that? All right, so one thing is I'm covering up ground. And as we know, many of our bees are ground nesters, and it can either limit access to get into the ground or they're trapped in there. Okay. So I wouldn't want to cover vast areas of this landscape with that tarping, as that could really harm those ground nesting bees. So doing it in small patches might be good. Another thing that I did was this was done early in the season, meaning right when those grasses germinate, probably like late November, December. And so at that time of year, most bees are in their burrows, dormant. They're in their nests. So how I like to think about it is like if it's hibernating and a tarp went over it and I pull it off in 4 weeks, maybe it didn't even notice. So that's another thing I factored in. But I wouldn't want to leave it down for like a year in a large area. All right, another non-toxic method I use is weed whipping those annual grasses. So pluses and minuses for weed whipping when it comes to bees. The positives are I can hit those grasses right before their seeds ripen. I can cover large areas. I can be very specific about which areas I weed whip. The drawback might be I could be disturbing nesting sites. So bees need areas where they're undisturbed. So remember those bumblebees like to nest under tufts of bunch grasses. So that could be one drawback. So it's this cost benefit. Is it outweighing the cost? Volunteer hand pulling. We have a very extensive volunteer program. I work with hundreds of volunteers a year. Thousands of them come out here. We're super fortunate that way. Not everybody has this at their disposal. But I do love to use volunteers. They can be super precise in their weeding. They're non-toxic and free for us. And it's also a great opportunity to do education about what we're doing, the importance of restoring these habitats, etc. So Oh, and I often incorporate some bee education around it, like during our break time, or we'll observe bees. So that's a great other way that it spreads. So I like that. Competitive natives. So on that bottom right, we'll often see areas that are really weedy. We'll use, I've used like competitive natives, in this case, Phacelia distans, to A, provide habitat, and then B, hopefully outcompete some of these annual grasses. I found it to be pretty effective. Looking at it from the bee perspective, Phacelia is a favorite of bees. They absolutely love it, all over it. You put a Phacelia out in the world, it's going to get covered with honeybees and many other species. The one drawback that I see of using a highly competitive species like this is in areas like the sand dunes, where there are many small native annuals that remain tiny, this competitive native can actually outcompete those and perhaps decrease the overall diversity in a patch if it gets too healthy. So it's plus and minus. I might keep it out of areas like, let's say, where the Lysingea is. All right, and lastly, I'm going to go into herbicides now. So again, like the herbicide is my last resort. I try to use those other methods first. But our director, in consultation with our IPM specialist, was encouraging us to try out a grass-specific herbicide, Envoy. And the idea was that the main weed challenge in these dunes are these non-native annual grasses. And then the plants that we're trying to protect are, for the most part, these native annual forbs. So perhaps this could be this silver bullet where we're able to spray right over that Lysingea, hit those grasses, and leave the plants we want to keep unharmed. But because I'm trying to be pollinator aware, I started just pulling on my understanding of bee natural history and said, okay, boss, I'm going to give this a try, but I'm going to try to do it in the way that is bee conscious. So this is how I did it. First, I checked the label. Looking at that label, there's actually nothing specifically mentioned about bees. That's likely because it wasn't shown to be highly toxic in the lab tests. But I'm not going to completely rely on that. So using the UC IPM Bee Precautions Pesticide Rating website, I looked up Envoy. You can look up either the brand name or you can look up the herbicide active ingredient name. And it'll give you a rating. They're pulling on different information to give it a rating on how risky it is to pollinators. And it gave a rating of 3. The higher, the better. So it was a very low risk herbicide according to the UC Bee Precautions pesticide rating. That was a good sign. Next thing I did was factored in seasonal timing. So the grasses were small in January and February, meaning I would have to use less herbicide. The other benefit of that in January and February, most of our bees at that cold time of year are still dormant. They're underground or they're in their nests. So less likelihood of direct spray contact with the herbicide. And another benefit of doing that early in the year was there are fewer flowers in bloom, which means there are less likelihood of spraying a forage plant. Another timing thing that I did was I did it early in the morning when it was cold. Again, that means less bees are out in the world flying around, less contact. And of course, best practices for avoiding drift and only spraying the target weed. And by the way, in this test out, I found it to be effective on what I'm calling like broader leaf grasses like ripgut brome and what do you call it? Italian rye. But Festuca bromoides, the rat tail fescue, it browned out and then resprouted. And that happened to me twice when I tried it on 2 different occasions and another coworker. It was not effective against that grass. And honestly, in my opinion, managing this dune, the biggest bang for the buck has been the early season tarping. Just getting those grasses under the control, there's enough seed bank that the natives just roar back in 2 years. That's been pretty awesome. I just want to show you what that UC IPM bee precautions pesticide rating looks like. Again, you can type, so I typed in the word envoy, and this is the output. So it gives you the common name of the pesticide. The rating, if it's a 3, it means no bee precautions from the information they were able to gather are necessary. And then it tells you whether there are, if there's information on whether it's toxic to honeybee broods, etc. So I like to kind of double that up, just get more information. All right. So here I would just love to see, just ask the group, using the same process, or maybe, and even bringing in your own thought process, how might you approach weed management of Oxalis pescoprae in this site? So we decided to try to enrich it with native plants. We put in baby phacelias, baby yarrows, baby buttercups, and planted them in between the hebe. But Oxalis is coming in strong here. It's coming in around our plantings and also all throughout the wood gypped area. How might you approach this through an IPM approach, but now with bee pollinator welfare in mind? So if anybody, I would love it if people were to either speak up, unmic, or put an idea out on the chat.
I would say a volunteer group to help with the weed pulling.
Thank you, Jose. Great idea. Yeah, kind of detail weeding, especially around those baby plants, and people enjoy yanking out those roots. Other techniques. For controlling that oxalis.
Might consider sheet mulching for at least a temporary fix.
All right, thank you, Dylan. So sheet mulching is a possibility.
Would torching be an option? Sorry.
Weed torching.
Torching.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose. Yeah, like we find with oxalis that it knocks it back. I haven't found it to kill it, but definitely knocks it back. Maybe with a regularity, it keeps it low enough that it meets the aesthetic.
You just have to repeat it like 2 to 3 times per season.
Have you found it to actually kill over the course of that time?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, it's the same thing as pulling, except you can cover 10 times as much area, right, in the same amount of time.
Okay.
But it's the same as pulling. You have to constantly go back and back and back every year to make sure that you're not like doing it and then blowing it off.
Okay. Awesome. Other ideas? Okay. Those are all great ideas. I'm just going to look at them through the bee lens. So the first idea was hand pulling with volunteers. Thinking about that from a bee perspective, I personally don't see any major impacts on bee nesting. It would be non-toxic. If you have the people, and it would be very precise. If you have the people power, I personally don't see any drawbacks for that from a bee perspective. The sheet mulching also can be effective. However, one thing, again, with our habitat, because we have ground nesting bees, we may consider, again, that mullet approach where perhaps the areas that are right along the sidewalk and highly visible, we could heavily sheet mulch, put big, thick layer of wood chips to make it look all pretty and clean. But maybe in the back, we have some areas that are not sheet mulch, maybe with, in fact, the mulch scraped back so that bees have access to the ground for ground nesting. And then with the flaming idea, especially with oxalis, because it's done early season. Actually, no, Peter's recommending several times throughout the season. Most bees would be underneath the ground or in those burrows. The only thing potential I could see is if we're burning up like let's say canes that we left on site for them or have been left on site where they're nesting in those little canes of dry pithy stems. But thank you all for those ideas. Those are great. Anybody else want to add anything before I move on? Let me add one thing, okay? One thing you may consider, and I'm just going to put this out there. And by the way, this is not the Presidio Trust policy. These are my thoughts and other people's thoughts in this field that study pollinators, is consider making friends with some weeds, or the idea of benign neglect. And so much research has shown that weeds can play an important forage for bees. And a quote from one of my favorite books of my professor, who is a bee specialist, and her co-author was, "We see weeds, bees see food." And some research has shown, so for example, by Dr. Morandin, looking in the agricultural systems, farms that were so weed-free saw declines in native bee populations. And another study looked at, this was in New Jersey, they looked at pollination by native bees in farms, and they first learned that 90% of the pollination services required for those farms were being provided by native bees flying in from the adjacent areas. And they found that the key factor in determining the abundance and diversity of those native bees were the weedy edges of non-native mustards. And so one thing that you may consider is where it's not a noxious weed or an invasive where it completely takes over and decreases the diversity of that site, you may consider leaving some of those weeds, because who has time to hit everything? And again, you may consider doing the mullet approach. Maybe in the areas where it's super important that there be a certain aesthetic, you hit those, put your energy there. But in areas where it's not that visible, those weeds might not be doing so much harm. And I know there's things about, seeds flying around, et cetera, but I just want to plant that seed. We can't hit everything, and there is benefits to them. Are some benefits. All right. Another thing that I want to talk about is mowing, nuanced mowing to benefit bees. So if you just think about this, how might you mow in such a way, or how might the ways that you mow be benefit bees? All right, I'll give you some thoughts here. So one study looked at the mowing frequency and found that there was this kind of sweet spot that actually where you got the highest richness and abundance of bees. It wasn't absolutely no mowing, and it wasn't super frequent mowing. It was kind of somewhere in between. And I'll talk a little bit why that might be. Another thing you can do to benefit bees and other pollinators is to raise the mower height to 3 or 4 inches to let the weeds flower. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. If you can leave some areas unmowed, so let's say there's an area where people picnic or whatever, or it's a ball field. Yes, you need to keep those areas really short, but are there some areas along the side that you can leave unmowed? And I'll talk about why that's important. And then lastly, can we plant in those adjacent areas to the mowed lawn to provide habitat? So let's look at each one of those things. Raising the mower height, what does that do? Well, that allows to keep the lawn still short to the eye, but at a height high enough that our flowering weeds can still flower, because bees see food. Two, if you can leave some areas unmowed, again, that's providing undisturbed habitat for nesting, and then those flowers are also allowed to flower. And then 3, can you find small patches, like let's say the size of a coffee table, to add a pollinator garden rich with native wildflowers? And I just want to share a study by Dale et al., who studied pollinator gardens that were planted in the roughs of golf courses. So the areas, the no play zones, a lot of potential habitat there. And they looked at 2 things. Did adding these native wildflowers, A, increase bee abundance, pollinator abundance? And B, they were curious, would it actually help control turf pests? And what they found was yes and yes. Planting the pollinator gardens with either 5 or 9 species of native wildflowers, seeding them, increased bee abundance and richness, and it decreased the levels of the turf pests. It was some type of worm that would mess up the lawns. And they did it in such a way that they knew it was aerial predators preying on these guys. So it brings in the natural enemies of our turf pests, these pollinator gardens. Another reason to do that. All right. And then lastly, one last scenario. French broom. How might you approach French broom control? And I'm just going to say, this looks kind of like prairie in this habitat with pollinators in mind. So an IPM approach to French broom, thinking about bees, butterflies, etc.
We've
Okay,
got a
so
comment in the chat of weed wrenches and lots of volunteers
okay.
and more that are coming in. Like selective
Gotcha.
pruning, cutting and peeling, leaving the stems for shelter.
Great. Great.
Would yanking out the roots, would that be a disturbance that we wouldn't want to have, or would that create opportunities for the bees with the holes and whatnot?
Right. Good question. I think it would loosen up the soil and perhaps make it a little bit easier to enter. It's true that we could be, like, let's say there are ground nests in there amid those roots. Yes, it's true that we could be disturbing nests that are currently active underground. That is true. So weed wrenching, of course, is the standard. I think it's like the net benefit is great, even if we did have to disturb some of the bees. Two, we may consider leaving the flowers out, like pulling post bloom, but before seeds ripen, so that they could use those flowers. That could be another thing. This is so invasive, though, that, I know we just got to be working on it whenever, like continuously. So, what else do I see? Strip. Cut stems before going to seed. Plant native species. All great ideas. Let's say we got rid of the adult plants. And then what comes up is this whole flush of seedlings. How might we approach that through IPM with pollinators in mind? Tiny little 1-inch seedlings, millions of them. Flaming is a great idea, love it. Tarping's also great, especially if we can get it down really soon and not have to leave it down for months, which would cover up ground nesting bees. Spray with milestone. Weed flaming early, at least twice after rains. Weed whipping early, nice. Oh, bring in the goats. With regards to grazing, the studies have shown like basically intensive grazing damages bee habitat, whether it be direct trampling of the ground nests, decreased forage because they're eating it. Light grazing, perhaps, could benefit. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Dione, can I interject real quick with the time check?
Yeah. Yes.
It's 10:57.
Yep.
We've had some good comments and questions coming in through the chat, so I wanted to make sure that we allocate enough time for Q&A and discussion. So maybe if you can wrap up in the next few minutes, does that work
Great.
for you?
I'm on the 2 last slides. And sorry, y'all, I did not see the comments until I thought I thought no one was commenting because I couldn't see the chat. Sorry. Only on this last slide was I seeing the chat. So if I didn't address your thing, thank you for putting out your thoughts on there, and I hope other people were able to see it. I will review them at the end of the presentation. So thank you for participating. All right. Let me go last. So in a nutshell, create habitat for bees, food, shelter, and safety. Food, native plants are awesome. Again, planting a few plants in something the size of a coffee table has a huge impact on both native bee abundance and richness. Shelter, leaving cut and pithy stems, leaving dead wood on site, using rock pavers, leaving some bare ground. And a lot of these practices, I feel, actually reduce our work. What if you didn't have to haul out all those pithy stems to the compost yard? When you're doing a tree removal, what if you don't have to haul out all of those dead trees? We've been using some of those, leaving them as dead stands. We've been instead of grinding the stumps, we're leaving them on site. We're leaving the dead stumps on site, leaving some bare ground. We can't cover everything. Give yourself a break, and it's actually beneficial to bees. And then lastly, for safety, I'm just recommending be thoughtful and be educated. B-E-E, thoughtful, B-E, educated about your decisions, and then you make the decisions. And using those resources like the UC IPM Bee Precautions website, reading the label, and I highly recommend a lot of these Xerces Society webinars specifically about pollinators and pesticides. And then leaving some areas unmowed or untilled. And Got to point out I'm old school. I love to read, like have my hands on an actual book. These are some of the ones I've enjoyed reading and super useful for the type of work that we do. Calscape, of course, great website. And thank you.